Today I'm going to be showing you how to make your own gorgeous pair of beaded skeleton earrings. I'll be working with 2 colors of my Delica beads. You'll need 1 gram of black and 2 grams of white. You can also use your seed beads in size 11 if you would like a slightly larger finished design, or size 15 if you would like it to be a little bit smaller. You're also going to need 2 ear wires and 2 matching 4mm or 5mm jump rings. Thread-wise, you need either white or black thread. You can also use clear fireline, and then you'll need a size 11 beading needle as well. In terms of tools, you're going to need 2 pairs of fine jewellery pliers. These are for opening and closing the jump rings and attaching your earring findings. We're going to start with the central row right down the middle of our skeleton at the bottom. So first thing that we're going to do is pick up 2 of our white Delica beads. Thread through them both to a little bit over halfway down your thread, and looping around, pass back up into both beads again. As you pull tight, you'll see that the 2 beads sit nice and neatly side by side. Just to make it extra secure, pass through both beads once more. You'll see they're sitting nice and snugly together side by side like that. With your thread exiting from the second bead, pick up another white Delica, and we're going to loop around and down into the other side of the exact same bead. As you pull tight, you'll see that this also sits beside the others. Let's go up into that bead that we've just added, and that now brings us into position with our thread exiting the very last bead. Go through and secure that bead once more, just by passing down into the bead previous and back up into that final bead one last time. Using that same method, we're going to continue adding all of the beads along the center of our skeleton. In total, there will be 15 white beads, 1 black bead, and then 3 more white beads. There we go. Last bead added on, and I'll just secure it as well. And up. There we are. And now we're in position, ready to start adding our next row. If you look closely at the work, you can see there's a little bridge of thread joining each bead to the next one. What we're going to do next is called brick stitch, where we're going to use those little bridges of thread to add a row of beads on top. To start, you need to pick up 2 beads. These are going to be the first 2 beads that sit at the end of the row. The reason we're picking up 2 beads is so that it will hide our thread when we're actually making our finished piece. Because this central row is the longest one, we want the next row to be just that little bit shorter than the previous one. So if you have a look closely, you can see there's the first bridge of thread, and here is the second bridge of thread joining the second and third beads. If you pick up 1 black and 1 white bead, we're going to go underneath that second little bridge of thread there and pull our thread all the way through until those beads are sitting above. We're then going to take this needle back up the second bead that we've just added, which is the black one, and being careful not to go back under that thread bridge, we're going to pull our thread all the way through so that that bead is sitting nicely above. Now you'll notice that the bead here isn't quite sitting right. Just to fix that one, this only happens when you're reducing the length of a row. We're going to weave down that bead and lock it to this bead beside. So we'll just skip what's underneath and go straight back up into that second bead, the little black one. As we pull that tight, that will just lock those little beads to sit nicely on top of our previous row. We'll now add just one bead at a time. So now we'll pick up a white bead and we're going to go underneath this next thread bridge. So under that little bridge of thread, pull all the way through and back up the bead that we've just added. Again, make sure that you don't go underneath that thread bridge, just avoid it completely and up into the bead. When you pull that tight, it'll now be in position sitting side by side with the next one. So now we can continue with the next bead. Again, this is going to be a white bead, so just pick up one bead, underneath that little bridge of thread there, pull it all the way through, and then back up the bead. There we go. And we're going to continue like that all the way down the length of our little spine piece here. There we are, and that's our second row complete. We're in position already, so now we can continue adding the beads of the third row. This third row is a little bit different because we're only going to add a few beads here, then we're going to leave a space, add a few beads more, and then a couple more at the very end. So it's a little bit different, but it's quite simple once you know what you're doing. Before I begin my next row, I'm going to just turn my work over. It's definitely going to be easier for you if you just flip the work over and just always work in the same direction for every row. We're going to start this row by reducing it as well. So we're going to pick up 2 beads once again. We're going to skip the first thread bridge and into the second thread bridge. Just like before, we're going to pull all the way through, get those beads into position, back up the first one, and then to make sure that that first bead sits neater, we'll pass down that bead and back up the second one once again to lock it into place. Just wiggle them around if you need to, hold it with your fingers and give it a nice tug until it's sitting neatly. We're going to leave a gap in this row here before we start adding more beads. So I'm going to weave down and into these beads so that I can go along till I reach the point where I want to start adding more beads. So I'll just weave back down into both of these endmost beads, all the way through, and we're going to just weave from one bead to the next. So up this bead and down the one beside it. Make sure your thread doesn't get caught, and it should just slip nicely underneath there. We'll go up the bead beside that one, down the next, and finally up the fourth little black bead. This is where we're going to start adding our next section of beads. So pick up one white and one black, skip the first thread bridge, and underneath the second one, pull all the way through, back up the black bead, down the white one, and back up the black bead. Just position them till they're sitting neatly. Now I'm going to continue working in the usual way, adding a few more beads for the rib cage section. There we go. We're now going to leave a small space until we're exiting from this little white bead just here. So once again, take our needle down the previous bead and into the row below, pull all the way through, and then we're going to just shimmy across from one bead to the next and continue along until we finally get to that little white bead here. Here we are. So now once again we're going to pick up 2 white beads, thread under not the first but the second thread bridge all the way through, and then lock them into position so that they sit neatly. There we go. See, now we've got half of his face. There's his neck. His little ribs are starting here. And then this is the, down here is the bottom of his little pelvis. So I need to add a couple of little beads just here. And then we can do his second side. So first thing I need to do is weave my thread around until I'm exiting from up here. So pass down the bead beside and into the following row, down below, and then we'll just go shimmy across into the next and the next, and now up both of these beads here. Here we are. Now we're in position to add our next few beads. We'll pick up 1 white and 1 black, skip the first thread bridge, and under the second thread bridge there, all the way through, and lock them into position. To add the last 2 beads in, we need to make sure that we're exiting from this white bead. So the way we'll do that is just by going down that bead, into the one below, across, and back up again. So it doesn't take too long to just weave ourselves around, and that'll bring us into position so that the beads can be added into the right spot. We're going to be adding these ones ever so slightly differently because we don't have that second thread bridge to attach to. To add these particular ones, all you have to do is pick up the 2 beads, go underneath the first thread bridge, pull all the way through, and back up into that first bead. You'll see that this adds those 2 beads, but they sit directly above the bead we were exiting. So this gives us a nice little shoulder piece sitting in position there, ready for us to add our first little limb a bit later on. So that's one side of our little skeleton piece now finished. We can take our needle off of our thread and we're going to put it onto our tail thread that we left free at the beginning of our work. We can then start making a second side that matches this first side exactly. So I've got my needle attached to this thread over here at the bottom now, so I can just weave up to make it the same on the opposite side. So if we have a look over here, you can see I'm going to start with 2 little white beads, just the same as before. We're going to skip the first thread bridge and underneath the second thread bridge. Back up the bead and lock them into position side by side. There we are. Now I'll continue adding beads along this row so that it matches this first row here. There we go. Now I can start adding the beads back down in this direction. Again, it'll be matching exactly what I have on the other side. I'll bring it back once I've finished these final little beads here as well. There we are. His body's all finished. Now we're ready to start adding on his limbs. With our threads exiting exactly from the bottom bead of that little shoulder piece, we're ready to start adding the first limb. Now, if you have a look, you can see I don't have that much thread left on this particular one, so I'll probably just use this one to do his single arm here. And then this other thread, which I have, which is much longer, I can do this arm and both of his legs down here. If you have more thread than I do here, that's great. You can do both this side and this one, and then use this thread for this side and this side. It doesn't matter though, you can do all four with a brand new thread or whatever takes your fancy. There's no problem when it comes to adding the limbs as per which thread you use. To make the first arm, I've picked up 15 Delica beads, and I'm exiting from this bottom little bead here. I'll thread them all the way down to his shoulder there, and you want to keep this relatively loose, because if you make it too tight, his arm will sit taut. If you keep it nice and loose, it'll be a bit more fluid, but obviously you don't want it to be too loose that it's floppy. To give our skeleton a nice hand shape, I'm going to skip these 3 beads here and weave all the way back up into these beads, back up here to the top, and into that bottom shoulder bead there as well. At this point, it's important to try and find a good level of tension. Just fiddle with his little beads of his fingers so that they sit nicely, but make sure that your tension isn't too firm. If you have a really firm tension, his arm will stick out proud, but if it's too loose, you'll see gaps in the work. So something like this is good, where you can see it moves around and it's fluid, but also there isn't any space in the arm there. I'm going to just weave back into the body now. It doesn't matter where you go, but just try and maintain that same level of tension before you continue. If you're happy that your tension is fine, just weave around one pair of beads a couple of times just to lock it in place. Try and make sure that the tension in the arm doesn't get too firm while you're doing this, and continue weaving around into a few more beads. There we are. And that thread is now nicely into the center of his body. So because I don't have much thread left on this particular one, I'm going to just use my scissors and cut this piece of thread off. Bring a pair of scissors in nice and close and just give that a cut. I'm going to attach my needle now to the other thread so that I can add this arm and the 2 legs at the bottom as well. Turn your work over so it's easy to work with. Pick up 15 more Delica beads in white, thread them down to his shoulder, skip those final 3 beads, and back up through all of those beads and into that shoulder once again. Just adjust his little finger beads so that they're nice, and try and match the tension on the other side of your work just there. Weave into the body, down the bead beside, and just before you go back into it again, just loosen that tension in his arm just to make sure it's sitting just right before you go back up into the bead that you first started from. There we go. That should now lock that thread into place, keeping this tension permanent, and now we can weave down into his legs down here. I want to make sure that I'm exiting from this bead right here in the center to the outside. So in this tiny little space just here, or just in here, this is where we're going to add our little leg pieces. So just weave your thread down until you're exiting from that bead towards the outside. There we are. Now that we have our thread in position, if you think about how a person looks, their legs are a little bit longer than their arms. So instead of 15 beads, we're going to thread on 19 of our Delica beads. Slide them down to the hip, miss the 3 end beads, up all the way through all of those beads, and back into the hip. Pull all the way through, but once again, make sure you don't pull too tight so that the tension doesn't stick up proud like this. You want it to be relatively loose so that there's a nice drape to the leg. Now we're going to weave across so that we're exiting from the opposite side. So now I'll pick up 19 more beads, slide them down to his hip, skip the last 3 beads, all the way back up, and into the hip. Just get your thread nice so that again your tension is good and the little foot is sitting just right. Weave up into the body of your skeleton, keeping the tension just right, down into the bead beside, and just around into the body a few times. Once you're happy that the thread is secure, bring your scissors in one last time and cut off the last of the thread. There we are, one finished little skeleton. See how his legs are still fairly loose and limber? That way when he moves, he's not going to be too stiff and sitting funny. To attach the earring, get a small jump ring. I have a 4mm jump ring just here. Open it up with a pair of pliers, like so. Slide it through the bead at the very top of your skeleton's head. It can be a little bit difficult, but with some persistence you will get it through. Like that. Bring in your ear wire piece, thread it onto the jump ring, and using your pliers once again, just close the jump ring over, like so, and giving it a gentle wiggle, just bring the two ends of the jump ring nicely into contact with each other, closed over really cleanly. There we are, all finished. All done and dusted. That's our first one finished. Make a second one in exactly the same way and you're ready to wear them.